All right, so I think it looks like everyone that we had sitting in the waiting room is in. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of eoPERCS. My name is Chrissy and we're very excited to have Matteo Fabbri from the Field Museum of Natural History talking to us today about diving behavior among dinosaurs. So before we get started, if you've not been to a eoPERCS before, our general format is this. We'll have this quick welcome and announcements, and then we'll hear Matteo's talk, followed by a moderated question and answer. And then Matteo has agreed to stick around for tea time after the talk as well. So during the talk, you can send your questions via the chat to the Questions at eoPERCS host, who today is Elizabeth. So some quick housekeeping. eoPERCS values the participation of everyone interested in the paleosciences. And so please remember to abide by our code of conduct today during today's seminar. You agreed to the code of conduct when you signed up for the mailing list. If you found yourself here without having done that, please head over to our website where you can read the code of conduct and all of that, and also sign up to get the emails for future talks. Please keep yourself muted for the duration of the talk. And if you have questions, you can send them anytime during the talk or the question and answer session to Elizabeth at the Questions at eoPERCS host. During the question and answer session at the end, you can also use the raise hand function if you'd rather ask your question out loud, and we'll unmute you at that time. Additionally, if you have technical issues, those should also go to the questions host. We have closed captions built into Zoom that you should be able to toggle by using the CC button to show or hide them as your preference. We'll also drop a couple of links into the chat, one for nominating an outstanding early career researcher who you'd like to see give a talk. And we're always looking for more nominations, including self-nominations. So if you know an early career person you think would give a good talk, or if you are an early career person who you think would give a good talk, please let us know with that form. And we'll also drop in the weekly feedback form for demographic information that we collect just to get an idea of who's attending talks. It's anonymous and optional, but encouraged. So please take a look at that as well. And finally, what you're here for, today's speaker is Dr. Matteo Fabbri, who Matteo got his bachelor's from the University of Florence in Italy, followed by a master's at Bristol in the United Kingdom, and then did his PhD at Yale in the US, and is currently a postdoc at the Field Museum of Natural History, where he's looking at this diving behavior in dinosaurs. So Matteo, if you want to take over the screen share, I think that's much more interesting than anything I have to say.
I doubt it. So here we go. Okay. I hope everyone can see the slide.
Yep, looks good to me.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me here at eoPERCS. It's my great pleasure to present my research. And today I will talk about diving behavior among predatory dinosaurs. And the reason this is kind of challenging is maybe in part historical in our discipline. And this is because when we think about tetrapods, that are all those animals with 4 limbs, we can see that through time, this group evolved more than 30 independent times secondary aquatic adaptations. So this means multiple groups went from a terrestrial ecology towards an aquatic one. And we have several examples nowadays that can be easily reminded of, like whales and hippos and seals. We have penguins and crocodiles, but we also have completely extinct clades such as mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs. So we can see in general that all this multitude of events towards aquatic environments happened in different groups, but also in different fashion. Indeed, basically from a morphological perspective, there is very little that we can compare between a whale and a hippo. Birds are no exceptions. Indeed, there is an entire group of birds called the aquatic group of birds, so not difficult to remember. But the important thing about this group in birds is that there is a wide range of ecologies that is characterizing multiple groups. And so we range from wading behavior, like in flamingos or herons, to proper diving behavior, for example, in penguins, where flight is completely lost, but they are excellent swimmers going underwater. And the fact that modern birds are characterized by aquatic or semi-aquatic adaptations is not a news, and it's not characteristic of only modern groups. Because even in the fossil record, we can find, especially in the Cretaceous, several examples of species and even groups that indeed were adapted towards aquatic environments. And the examples are Ichthyornis and Hesperornis from Kansas, but also other stem birds from China. So it seems like this kind of acquisition of ecological adaptations have been important in the evolution of tetrapods in general through time. However, there is one major exception to this rule, which is non-avian dinosaurs. And for many decades, we thought this group was mainly restricted to terrestrial environments, and that this was due to their constrained anatomy in the pelvis. Indeed, dinosaurs and modern birds have the femur, which is intersocketing the pelvis, and this means they have a very low range of motion, and therefore this was suggested as evidence that maybe dinosaurs were not made for swimming into water. However, this didn't stop several group of researchers during the last century and beyond proposed that at least some groups of dinosaurs were indeed linked to aquatic environments. And probably the oldest suggestions of this kind of ecology in non-avian dinosaurs are for sauropods, that are the long-necked dinosaurs, and duck-billed dinosaurs like hadrosaurs. And so regarding sauropods, this was suggested because of their giant size. And so we thought they couldn't walk on land because of their weight. Now we know that in reality, this is actually not true, and that their skeleton is pneumatized. So they were actually way lighter than we previously expected. And regarding duck-billed dinosaurs, we can now see how previous suggestions were not exactly as strong as we previously thought. And indeed, we found some mummies for these dinosaurs early in the 19th century that can be seen at the American Natural History Museum of New York and other museums around USA. And these skeletons preserving skin showed that their feet had paddles in some ways. So the fingers were connected by integument resembling the duck-like feet. So they were suggested as swimmers on the surface or shallow waters. But later on, we understood that most probably this was just evolutionary constraints regarding their cursorial habits rather than swimming. More recently, we had the suggestions for ornithomimosaurs. such as Gallimimus. This was published by a Canadian and American team, and exceptional preservation on some of these fossils showed that these dinosaurs had Aramphotheca, with really small projections suggest filter feeding in these animals. And what is also kind of supporting this kind of hypothesis is the fact that some ornithomimosaurs were found with vegetables and like other kinds of plants and leaves and algae in their stomach. And finally, we have Alscaraptor, which is the most recent of all, where this early dromaeosaur was suggested based on body proportions to be more similar to a duck, and therefore probably its ecology was semi-aquatic rather than fully terrestrial. But there is one group in particular, which is the one of Spinosaurids, which is a group of carnivorous dinosaurs that ranges from mid to large size. And it's widespread all over the world, exception made for North America and Antarctica, at least for the moment. And this group is characterized by a very peculiar morphology of the snout, which is crocodile mimic. They have conical teeth, and all these kind of morphological traits were suggested to be for fishing. And this was in part kind of supported in some ways by gut contents in the holotype of Baryonyx, which is this Spinosaurid from UK, where in the stomach content we could find fish scales. So this was kind of a counter proof of this kind of adaptations, at least in feeding. However, a big push towards a more semi-aquatic adaptation in Spinosaurids came with the discovery of the skeleton of Spinosaurus aegyptiacus. So historically, this has been a very elusive dinosaur to find. This is because the first skeleton belonging to this species was found by a German paleontologist in the Baharia Formation of Egypt, which is Cretaceous. And what Ernst Stromer found was the first evidence of this giant-sized predatory dinosaur, already suggested to be bigger than T-Rex. But what was really peculiar about this animal was the crocodile mimic face and the fact that it had a huge sail in the dorsal portion of the skeleton. And so Ernst Stromer described this animal as a fish-eating animal coming from the Cretaceous, and then brought the skeleton to Germany. However, soon the Second World War started to create problems, obviously. Ernst Stromer was really worried about the collection of fossils that he found in Egypt, including the only known skeleton of Spinosaurus. And he asked the Führer and the government at that time to hide all archaeological and paleontological artifacts, because he feared that during the Second World War, the UK and the USA military would destroy and bombard Germany, destroying any evidence of all the scientific work that he has done. And no one listened, and Stromer was right, because eventually in 1944, Munich was bombarded by the UK Air Force, and the entire collection of fossils from North Africa was completely destroyed. So we had to wait almost 100 years before finding a new skeleton that in this case comes from the Sahara Desert, but on the Moroccan side, from the Kenken beds. These are Cretaceous sediments that are equivalent in age and fauna to the Baharia Formation. And I was lucky enough to be in the team that excavated this skeleton. And we found the giant sail, or at least part of it. We found a part of the skull and part of the cervical vertebrae that suggests that this is indeed the Spinosaurus based on the apomorphisms that were described by Ernst Stromer. But what we found is also the pelvis, that was a complete news for this species, and the tail. And what we can say, or at least the way we described this animal and these anatomical features, is that this dinosaur had very short hind limbs in comparison to any other predatory dinosaur. It had very wide feet that suggest a paddle-like, duck-like morphology. And it has these long, narrow spines in the tail, in the caudal vertebrae, that seem to increase the surface, the lateral surface of the tail, suggested that in some way this could have been used as a propulsive structure. So in other words, we suggested that this animal was capable of swimming, was spending a lot of time in water, and that this was the first evidence, the first time that we had direct evidence for a non-avian dinosaur to actually spend a lot of time in water. However, how you can imagine, this created a huge debate in the field where other groups suggested that this animal was actually not capable of swimming, and it's neither sure if this animal was spending time into water, because once we take every single morphological trait and we try to explain it from its correlation with ecology, then we can find alternative hypotheses that might not suggest that this animal was spending time in water. And for example, the fact that it has a crocodile mimic face with conical teeth, yes, it suggests that it was fishing, but this could be done with a heron-like ecology. So basically wading from riverbanks and just putting their face into water, waiting for fish to pass by. The fact that it had shorter hind limbs is not necessarily linked towards an aquatic adaptation, and the fact that there is a sail and long narrow spines in the tail might be suggesting for inter and intra-specific social behavior rather than actual swimming. So this all means that if we are all looking at the same bones and we come up with completely opposite hypotheses and interpretation of such morphology, maybe anatomy is not the best proxy to infer ecology, or at least this is what I was wondering. And once you start to look at the skeleton of different semi-aquatic or aquatic animals nowadays, indeed, this seems to be the case, because when we look at whales or skeletons of whales in general, what we see is that there are striking patterns in their anatomy and body plan that suggest aquatic adaptations. They have enlargement of the skull, they have fins and flippers, and they generally lose or reduce the pelvis and the hind limbs, and they have this elongation of the body. However, when we look at the hippos that we know for sure are spending a lot of time in water, and they are also excellent bottom walker animals, but are also very fast swimmers, we can see how the skeleton of these animals show very little anatomical transformation towards a semi-aquatic adaptation. So what I was wondering is, if we didn't have any alive hippo today, how good would we be in inferring a semi-aquatic adaptation in these animals in the fossil record just based on anatomy? And the same can be addressed for early branching and diverging species, such as early whales that are here represented by Indoaius and Ambulocephus. These animals resemble way more terrestrial animals rather than modern whales, although we know through isotopic analysis and other proxies that these animals were already spending a lot of time in water for sure. And when we look at modern animals and we try to infer their ecology, diet, and function based on their morphology, we find that there are several surprises. The main one, which is the fact that morphology has only a weak or absent correlation with function. And one of the most striking examples, at least in my opinion, was this paper by Guillermo Navalon in 2019, where he tested the macroevolutionary correlation between bird beak and diet, which is one of the most striking evidence Charles Darwin used for showing selection and evolution and as a proof of all these factors. And what they found is that there is no correlation at the macroevolutionary level, which is obviously very surprising. And some other papers, this is one that I did for my PhD, but I can assure you there are tons in the literature, show that developmental pathways and patterning of ossification is indeed a major factor in reducing such correlation between adult morphology and ecology. This is because the skeleton appears only later on in development, and it's just the outcome of soft tissue patterning early on in development. So in other words, the skeleton is the last output in development, and therefore it's more, should be considered more like a trade-off between developmental requirements and satisfying ecological needs. So probably developmental pathways are one of the main reasons why morphology is not correlating so much with ecology. So keeping in mind all this, we thought maybe we needed a different proxy to determine ecology in the fossil record. And what I thought it was an idoneous one was bone density. This is because there has been a lot of studies since the 80s that showed how in general aquatic or semi-aquatic animals usually have a higher bone density, while volant and terrestrial animals are more lightly built. However, the problem is that this kind of proxy was used within single clades, so we still don't know if there is a correlation of this proxy at the macroevolutionary level. And the second thing is that if indeed this proxy has potential for inferring ecology in extinct taxa, then can we apply it to non-avian dinosaurs and finally test if some of these groups were indeed adapted to aquatic environments? So what I did was to create the largest dataset ever assembled for this kind of proxy. It counts around 297 species, and we used 206 femora and more than 170 dorsal ribs. This is because we wanted to see if only some skeletal portions were indeed bringing this kind of signal, or if indeed this ecological correlation can be tested throughout the entire postcranium. Among the clades that we covered in the dataset, we have obviously modern mammals, lizards, crocodiles, and birds. But we also included several extinct taxa, including early whales, marine reptiles, early birds, non-avian dinosaurs, of course, but also stem mammals, and we have archosauromorphs and pterosaurs. So we have a pretty good coverage of all the major groups composing amniotes. And the general transformation of the data was pretty much simple, although time consuming. What we did was to use CT scans or osteological thin sections of dizzy bones, femur and dorsal ribs. And then these were imaged and then converted to a black and white section. This is because we were using a freely available software, which is called the Bone Profiler. And this basically quantifies black dots against white. And so in this way, through radiance, is able to calculate the overall bone density of the section. And this is just like a small picture of 1/4 of the data set, just to give you an idea of how massive this data set is. And here you can see how much bone density is indeed varying between clades, between bones, and between ecologies, as we will see pretty soon. These are the 3 Spinosaurids that I was able to include. These are the better preserved ones because we have a lot of different species that are just based on fragmentary remains. And so in this case, you can see obviously Spinosaurus, but we also added Suchomimus, which is a Spinosaurid from Niger, and Baryonyx, which is one of the most famous Spinosaurids, and it was the first one found in UK. Another thing that we did was the categorization of ecological extremes. In other words, all animals are capable to perform non-demanding ecological behaviors, for example, walking. But on the other hand, very few animals are capable to satisfy the extreme needs of their ecology. So for example, if we think about a penguin, diving underwater up to 500 meters of depth is extremely demanding. And penguins are capable of doing it, but pelicans or ostriches or parrots cannot. On the other hand, parrots, ostriches, and pelicans can walk on land as penguins do. And the same is true for power flight. So what we did was to use categorization of ecological behaviors based on these issue extremes, the ability of diving underwater and the ability of having power flight. And we have 3 states for each ecological categorization. So for example, we got for subaqueous foraging or diving, we have unable, able but infrequent. But to be fair, it's also partial diving behavior. So like, for example, herons are capable of go underwater for only part of their body, which is usually the head and part of the feet because of their wading ecology, but they are not capable of diving underwater like penguins, or frequent and full immersion like penguins. On the other hand, for flying, we got unable, non-sustained flight, such as animals like tinamous and chickens or turkeys. And then a sustained flight, like, for example, parrots and pelicans and other animals that are capable to fly for long distances. And we also used allometry as a potential explanation of bone density. So we use the maximum diameter of all the sections that we used as a proxy for body size. And eventually we included this variable to figure out which kind of proxy or variable is explaining the most among the variability of bone density at the macroevolutionary level. And so in general, when we start to run a series of phylogenetically corrected regressions linear regressions between all these variables against bone density, what we found is that in general, there is a strong phylogenetic signal for bone density. So this means that there is no universal threshold to see what is a high bone density for diving or what is just the average bone density of the clade. And in other words, it means that birds are generally lighter and they have lower bone density than mammals, for example. But we also find out the best model explaining the variability of bone density across our dataset is indeed the capability of fully submerged underwater. And so any animal that is aquatic slash semi-aquatic and is capable of fully submerged and dive underwater does show a rapid increase of bone density across their entire postcranium. However, wading behaviors such as the herons or any other volant and terrestrial animal actually show a very low bone density. So this was great because it meant that we found a striking correlation between this proxy, bone density, with a specific ecological behavior. And then when we look in general at the kind of ranges that we find in bone density, we see how volant animals are indeed pretty lightly built. Terrestrial animals are usually with a higher bone density, but still in the range of lower values. And it's only with shallow water animals that are capable of diving that indeed we find a very high bone density characterizing their postcranium. And these kind of changes, at least in the arrangement of the bone with the pelagic animals. So all those diving animals that are capable of going to great depth to catch a fish or their prey in general. And an example are modern whales and ichthyosaurs, where the bone tissue is actually rearranged in trabecular bone. So they form a network of bone rather than having a thick cortex. And this is because they have to avoid the implosion due to high pressure. So when we try to figure out the range of bone density per ecological categorization, what we find is that in this case, it's a regression against the body mass and using bone density across a femur. And what we find is indeed that there is some clear clusters that are going around with the higher bone density, characterizing the pelagic or diving animals. We have an intermediate cluster with the red dots that are characteristic of terrestrial animals. And finally, we have flying animals here with of course, the yellow dots. But what is important here is that this kind of plot and the categorization in general is giving us an 85% correct classification rate among modern taxa. So this means that if you give me 100 species, and I need to guess the ecology based on bone density, this will be correct 85% of the time, which is a pretty good guess, especially when we think about the fact that we are including such a diverse range of ecologies in our dataset. And when we go to look at the general range of bone densities, here depicted as violin plots, we find that two Spinosaurid dinosaurs that are Spinosaurus and Baryonyx have indeed some of the highest bone densities ever appeared among amniotes. while all other non-avian dinosaurs and groups, including another Spinosaurid, which is Suchomimus, these fall within the terrestrial cluster. However, we didn't want to just see where dots were falling. So what we did based on our categorization and correct classification rate was to guess, statistically guess, a posteriori, the ecology and the capability of diving in extinct taxa. And so what we did was to generate 100 different trees that were generated randomly with different branch length in order to see if indeed the stratigraphic range and uncertainty had a weight in our guess. And we ran predictive models to infer if Spinosaurus and Baryonyx and other dinosaurs were indeed capable of diving or not. And finally, we collected how many times they were coming out as divers at the end of each iteration and at the end of the 100 iterations. And so what we find is that Spinosaurus and Baryonyx, based on the femur, have basically 100% of the time are coming out as diving, and so subaqueous foragers, while all the other dinosaurs have a very weak or absent possibility based on bone density to actually be able of diving. And the same results are true when we use dorsal ribs. And so in this case, you see that we found 96 and 95 of the times Spinosaurus and Baryonyx as subaqueous foragers. So all this suggests that there is a very strong probability based on our proxy that they were indeed spending a lot of time in water. And then in a more qualitative sense, what is important to say is that osteosclerosis or a high bone density is present also in other appendicular skeletal elements like the tibia or the dorsal neural spines, the pelvic region, and other, of course, the dorsal ribs as we saw. And Spinosaurus and Baryonyx indeed have a very high bone density all over their postcranium, which is strikingly different from other dinosaurs that are not only predatory dinosaurs, but are all ornithischians and sauropods. So when we put all this in a simplified evolutionary model, what we can say is that terrestrial ecologies are indeed very widespread among dinosaurs and are probably the ancestral condition. However, based on the current phylogenetic hypothesis for Spinosaurids and based on the data that we have, high bone density seems to be ancestral to Spinosaurids. And therefore, Suchomimus, which was found more terrestrial, or in any case, non-diving in our results, comes out as a secondary loss of a high bone density in its skeleton. And the appearance of a high bone density in the postcranium of these animals seems to be correlating with a crocodile mini snout characterized by conical teeth. And so if we want to be a little bit more romantic about the topic, we can actually figure out that these animals were living in a riverine system. The deepest river in which these animals are found is around 5 meters deep. So we are not talking about great depth. But at the same time, they were all living with ecosystems that had very large fishes surrounding them. And so we think these animals were just specialized as ambush predators or more active predators. Is pretty difficult to say. But in any case, where animals were capable to go underwater to catch their prey in one way or the other. And so in conclusion, what we can say is that Our analysis show the potential for bone density as a very good proxy at the macroevolutionary level to infer indeed ecological adaptations in extinct taxa. What is really important, in my opinion, and that's probably the power of this proxy, is that you don't need to have an entire skeleton to figure out what the ecology of the animal was, but you just need the right bone and the right data set to figure out how you can infer such ecology. And this is pretty handy because the big majority of fossils actually are characterized by fragmentary material. So although we might not know the anatomy of the entire animal, we might be able to infer its ecology pretty easily. And in terms of dinosaur adaptations, we can say that indeed dinosaurs were pretty much restricted to terrestrial environments, with only few exceptions, in this case the Spinosaurids among the clades that we studied, but I'm pretty sure they were more widespread among ornithischians. And we figured out that indeed the diversity, the ecological diversity among extinct taxa is probably way bigger than we previously thought. Indeed, although all Spinosaurids share a similar anatomy in some way or the other, still Baryonyx and Suchomimus seem to have a very different ecology. And so with this, I want to thank obviously my postdoc advisor, Jim O'Connor, and the Field Museum who is hosting me for my postdoc. I want to thank all the co-authors who helped in this research. And I want to thank Davide Bonadonna and Marco Auditore for the illustrations you saw in this presentation, and obviously all the funding agencies that made this research possible. And so now I am ready to get your questions. So thank you.
All right, thanks. That was very, very cool. It's now the question and answer time. So just a reminder, you're welcome to send questions in the chat to Elizabeth, the questions at eoPERCS host for today. You can also raise your hand and we'll let you unmute yourself to ask a question, keeping in mind that the code of conduct and that you should be respectful and all of those things. We do already have actually a decent number of questions that have come in. So if you're ready, we'll go ahead and get started.
Yeah.
All right. So our first question comes from Sender. I'll put it into the chat. Says, hello, good morning. Just a question regarding the secondary invasion of water, as there is an increased number of tetrapods secondarily invading the water, especially after the KPG. Are there any particular reasons for this, and can the absence of the main Mesozoic marine reptiles be credited to this?
Well, so for sure, in part, that's definitely the answer. Like during the Mesozoic, we had 3 different groups that invaded marine environments that are obviously Plesiosaurs, Ichthyosaurs, and Mosasaurs. And they were all large-sized, obviously, and they occupy different niches. Apparently, this is what we are currently thinking. Like, we know that Ichthyosaurs were mainly pelagic, Mosasaurs were the same, while Plesiosaurs seems to be more restricted to shallow water and also riverine systems. However, to be fair, this seems to be the case only for marine environments, because when we think about it, turtles were already becoming marine. Like, for example, we have from Kansas the Archelon, which is this giant marine turtle, part of Protostegids. We still have today marine turtles as well. In the rivers, we have the presence of crocodiles already, and we do have them today as well. So I would say that the riverine systems, the only thing we are missing today are Spinosaurids. For the rest, it was pretty much the same. In marine environments, large marine reptiles were challenged, obviously, by the rise of mammals that today are occupying all the large-sized ecologies in pelagic environments. But yeah, I think marine reptiles' disappearance was part of the answer. Why reptiles didn't do again marine environments is kind of tricky to say, really.
So you mentioned turtles in your answer for that one. There was a question I missed just in the chat right before the one I dropped. How do diving turtles rate on the bone density scale?
Okay, so the turtles were represented by very few species, which is kind of the regret of my study. They have a high bone density. Turtles, in any case, have, as average, a higher bone density, but diving turtles are still osteosclerotic. That being said, I know that there is a study by Seriosha Evers and part of this group that is looking into turtles at the macroevolutionary level more in detail. So I guess we will have to wait for it. I hope it will come soon out.
Yeah, all right. So we have another one. This one says, fascinating talk. Are there changes in bone density in animals through ontogeny? And if so, do you think these changes reflective of developmental needs, changing ecology, or both?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And the answer is yes. So during the collection of the data, we got some juvenile dinosaurs and also some juvenile birds that eventually were excluded from the final result. And the reason is that when you start early on in ontogeny, your skeleton is lightly built independently from your adult ecology. So for example, I have a good ontogenetic series of alligators from a hatchling to adult. They are around 15 different ontogenetic stages. And what you see is that the hatchling has basically the same bone density of a bird. And then later on, it increases bone density. And this seems to be reflective of the ecology, because when we think about the alligator ecology, early on, they stay close to the riverbank, eating insects and stuff on the surface of the water. And only when they are adults, they manage to fully dive, catch fish or other big preys. So there is definitely an ontogenetic pathway that is very interesting to dig into. Part of why birds might have such light skeleton could be related to the fact that they are pedomorphic. Therefore, the fact that they do not have a prolonged ontogeny, they remain with the hollow bones. However, this doesn't explain penguins. So the fact that you have development influencing this proxy doesn't mean that it's fully explaining it. And well, I'm currently kind of working on it, but we are far from having a definitive answer. So in general, development has an influence. That's why we only use adult individuals or sub-adult individuals in our data set, but it's still unclear to me how much it's influencing and in which way.
Yeah, that'll be interesting to see once you're done with the, yeah.
Hopefully soon.
So there was another one that jumped in just before I put in the last question that says, good afternoon, Matteo. Great talk, very informative and exciting. Just a quick question. Are there any dinosaurs and other genera that you'd like to add to your data set or make comparisons with?
Yes, there is one specific one that I would love to, which is called Lurdosaurus. And this is a very chubby, stout animal, which is a duck-billed dinosaur. But contrary to all duck-billed dinosaurs, all others, this animal resembles really a hippo. Like the rib cage is large and concave. And so I think that's a great species to test, and I hope it will happen in the future. I was not able to do it. This dinosaur is found in Niger, and there are several skeletons in Paris. So maybe one day, or maybe other groups will do it, I hope, because it's a very weird animal. There are definitely ornithischian clades that I was not able to include in the dataset. These are ankylosaurs and dinosaurs like that. So ornithischians in general, I would love to add them, but they are just too large to be imaged and sectioned. So, well, maybe one day, but not yet.
So something a little bit different.
Yeah.
This one from Emma says, very cool, thanks. Have people done any oxygen carbon isotope analyses on these animals to infer aquatic habitats? Something like what's been done with whales, for example. And then a second question, how do you know that bone density patterns are preserved over time in these fossils?
That bones?
Sorry?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? Sorry.
Oh, sure. It's also in the chat, if you can see the chat at all. It says, how do you know that bone density patterns are preserved over time in these fossils?
Okay. So, well, let's start from the isotopes. Yes, it was done in North African Spinosaurids. And independently for carbon or oxygen, whatever you use, it comes out that the isotopes preserve, the isotope ratios preserved in the teeth of these animals are resembling crocodiles and are very different from all long-necked dinosaurs or other predatory dinosaurs like Carcharodontosaurids and Abelisaurids. So it clearly shows how these animals are most probably spending a lot of time in water, at least with their mouth, rather than being terrestrial. Then regarding the bone density preserved through time, we know because we can recognize bone tissue in fossils, and we can recognize what is sediment or not. So as long as you have a fossilized bone, then it should be pretty straightforward once you do thin sections to know what is bone or what is matrix.
All right. So another question, I pasted it twice by accident. Okay. So does the interpretation of an aquatic ecology imply any kind of function for the Spinosaurid tail or
yes.
sail? Sorry.
For the sail. Okay. So regarding the sail, this is one of the biggest mysteries, if you want. I don't think we will ever know, to be fair, because when you speak about a function of a structure like that has no analog in modern animals, then it becomes very difficult to infer it in ecosystems that are barely preserved. So what we currently think, based on histology, is that the bone tissue in the sail was not very well vascularized, like in Dimetrodon. So we think that it was not used for thermoregulation. That being said, what is used for, it's very difficult to say. Probably it was a social structure or like a display structure to show where an individual was fishing, or it was just to attract mates. We don't know. We really don't know. But we will see. I mean, every year there are methodological innovations and we learn something new. I think that with the current knowledge we have, it's very difficult to say what it was used for. It's easier to say what it was not used for. But it's still in the air. I don't know.
All right, we've got another one. Let's see, this one says, hi, it's from Candela. Hi, lovely presentation, amazing talk, and such an interesting subject. I have one question regarding the environment where Spinosaurus has been found. I don't know about the Kem beds, but at least part of the Baharia Formation has been reconstructed as a lagoon. So could it have lived in coastal settings and therefore been swimming in the ocean too?
Yeah, so the fact is that we find no marine sediment or marine animal in those sediments. So North Africa in general is depicted as a deltaic system that was just going towards the Tethys, which was this big ocean during the Cretaceous, dividing the Gondwanian or let's say continent and or because it was already breaking up, so whatever, the Gondwanian part and the Eurasian one. That being said, we do not have any kind of sediment that suggests coastal environment. They are all freshwater sediments. So the lagoon is more like a deltaic system. And yes, the sea wasn't far from the sediments we have. And the reason we know that is because we have a transgression, a marine transgression. So on top of the Kenken beds and on top of the Baharia Formation, you find marine calcareous sediments with marine gastropods and other kind of marine animals. But regarding the Kenken beds, we think that it was more a freshwater environment. And regarding Spinosaurus, going towards salty waters, usually you can find in the frontals some fossae that are correlated with the presence of salt glands in birds. And they are present in Hesperornis and Ichthyornis and all these kind of more marine environment birds. And we do not find them in any Spinosaurid. So probably they were salt intolerant.
Okay, we've got just a couple more questions that we want to try and get to. So if people want to hang on for a few minutes afterwards, that would be good. But there's also tea time, of course, so you're welcome to stick around for that too. So this one says, this is so cool. Are there other groups that you particularly think should be reassessed for diving behavior using this bone density approach?
Yes, reassessed are definitely Hadrosaurids, which are still part of Ornithischians. Because I'm sure, well, as said before, there are at least some of them that I think they might be diving or spend a lot of time in water at least. Groups regarding predatory dinosaurs are definitely stem birds that should be reassessed because until now it's mainly morphological. Regarding their ecology and gut contents and claw curvature and stuff like that. But I think that bone density might help there. And the one group that I would love to check are Therizinosaurs that I couldn't check. But these are animals that are characterized by a long neck and large forelimbs and large claws. But they are very weird in their anatomy. And so I don't know what's going on with them, and I would love to test it in there for sure.
Okay, maybe we can just sneak in one more quick question, which is, what do you think a close ancestor of Spinosauridae would look like now that you've estimated the aquatic ancestry of the group, or what kind of aquatic adaptations might appear before others?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question. And the problem is that we have a huge ghost lineage for Spinosaurids. This is because all the species we know are coming from the Cretaceous. But according to the divergence of Tetanurans, which are all those dinosaurs with 3 fingers and start to have more rigid tail and so on. But anyway, it's all the dinosaurs, including Allosaurus, Spinosaurids, Megalosaurus, all the kind of stuff, diverge in the Jurassic around the Toarcian. So we have a lot of millions of years, many millions of years, where we don't have any species that is part or involved in the radiation of Spinosaurids. So in my opinion, what we should look for are late Jurassic sediments, where we will find something that is very similar to an Allosaurus or Asphaltovenator or Megalosaurus, but probably starts to have shorter hind limbs, because in general, even Baryonyx and Suchomimus do have shorter hind limbs in comparison to other predatory dinosaurs. So that seems to be a key element for the early evolution of the group. But at the same time, you can never know. Because if you look at modern birds, or you look even at the latest birds in the Cretaceous, and you should guess what is the ancestral bird look like, you would never guess Archaeopteryx, because all the modern and latest birds in the Cretaceous have a pygostyle, have very weird proportions that are characteristic of crown birds. So it's very difficult to predict anything, really.
All right. Well, thank you very, very much. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I think we managed to get to at least one from everyone who sent them. So if you have more questions, again, Matteo can stick around for tea time. But yeah, thanks again very much for your talk. And
Thank you.
I'm going to just take back the screen share briefly. And do that. Okay. So again, thank you very much, Matteo. And thank you everyone else for joining us and for all your questions. It was great to have such a lively question and answer session this week. So we'll drop the weekly feedback form back into the chat in case you didn't get a chance to fill it out before. Again, it's optional and encouraged and anonymous. And join us next week where we'll hear from Sean Thatcher at the City University of New York College of Staten Island, who will be continuing our field series with a talk called A Field Course for Everyone, The Benefits of Accommodation and Inclusion in Field Experiences. And so, as I mentioned, we have tea time. So if you didn't get your question in or didn't get all of your questions in, please feel free to come and ask them or chat about whatever we want to chat about with Matteo. So it's generally just an informal sort of conversation time where we can talk a little bit more. Our question of the week is, if you had to be an Ichthyosaur or Plesiosaur, what would you be and why? And so with that, we'll have a quick break so you can get up, stretch your legs, get your tea, whatever you want to do with your 2 minutes. Yeah, come back after that. Bring any paleo pets or friends you want to show off in the tea time as well. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and hope to see you in a couple minutes. And of course, thank you, Matteo, for your talk.
Thank you for having me.